Hi, wonderful AP Human Geography students. Dr. Gillespie here. And we're going to explore political geography, and it's a very important part of learning AP Human Geography, and it's heavily tested in your exam. So I want you to pay particular attention to this unit as well as the unit on cities and urban uh, topics because these are the two most heavily tested in the exam. So we really need to dig down deep. So for that reason, I'm preparing a couple of extra political geography YouTubes that I will be posting in the next few days. This is sort of part one of politics and geography for you. So I want you to realize, and I'm sure you already have had this in other courses, and we're probably going to go a lot into history just to form a basis for the political geography that we'll be talking about. So bear with the historical tidbits I give you. I think they'll be useful for you to be able to pull everything together in this political geography unit. So, people have always, from the beginning of time, been organizing and structuring their society. Um, Geographers are interested in this structuring because it is an expression of how humans organize space. And it's closely related to other spatial bits of culture, such as religion and language and ethnicity. Political geography then is the study of the organization and distribution of political phenomena, including their impact on other spatial components of society and culture. Political geography is mainly concerned with the study of the spatially uneven outcomes of political processes and the ways in which political processes themselves are influenced by spatial structure. So, modern political geography in this day and age, we usually look at, well, how and why states are organized into regional groups. So, we have regions that are formal, such as the European Union is a formal regional grouping. We have informal regional groupings, such as the first world, second world, third world countries, that sort of thing. We also want to look at the relationships between states, which in this unit we refer to states as a political unit, a country, and their former colonies, and even in today, the neocolonialism that is continuing that colonial relationship. The relationship between a government and its people, and consider even that people living in a country are not necessarily citizens, they can be residents. So what is the impact of having residents in charge of the country, more or less, and the difference between that and having the citizens in charge of the country? We'll look at relationships between states, between countries, including international trade and treaties. We'll look at the functions of boundaries and the ways in which boundaries are set up and how they are policed. We'll look at the influence of political power on geographical space and how communications, telephone, radio, television, internet, social networks, how they have implications on political geography. And we'll also look at the study of election results, which is electoral geography. So let's dig in and learn something about the very important political geography unit we have to learn. The first thing I want, and I suggest you can pause the video and at least jot down the terms on this paper, because you will have the terms also in your Fellman textbook, but you can also come back to this and take some notes if you wish. But the first term that we want to look at is state, and we will define state as a group of people with a common culture who occupy a particular territory and who are bound together by a strong sense of unity that arises from shared beliefs and customs. So, state is not anything to do with Ohio or Pennsylvania or Texas. It's an international entity, an independent political unit in our study now. The composite term nation state refers to a state whose territorial extent coincides with that occupied by a distinct nation or people. There are very few nation states that we could list that are 100% one people or one nation of people who share common background, culture, language, etc. And I will give this list to you here. Iceland, Denmark, Poland, and Japan. In fact, Japan has a very homogeneous nation of people living there. They have a few, very few ethnic minority people who live on the northern islands in particular, but I think 98% of the people living in Japan are of the same Japanese group of people. They are of the same genetic and cultural background. Now, a multi-nation state or multinational state is one that contains more than one nation, and it is the opposite of a nation state. And I give you Canada and Cyprus. Cyprus, of course, is an island in the Mediterranean. Half of the island is owned or is Turkish, and half of the island is Greek. So you will also note that Canada has basically a British state, but it has also the province of Quebec, which is French, and always wanting to split away and become their own country. So at any rate, that is a stateless people is a people or a nation without a state, a people without a place to call home. And of course, the number one example through history for many, many, many years has been the Jewish people. For centuries, they have suffered for lack of a homeland unit until 1948 and Israel. But we have other examples of people who do not have a state. And we would want to say indigenous people as they appear in various countries of the world. In the Native American cultures, actually in the United States, or the First Nation people in Canada, or the Aboriginal people, they've been maneuvered into minority status in their home countries by former colonial powers, but they are essentially a stateless people. The Gypsies, the Roma people in the lower photo, this lady, have roamed around Europe for centuries without a home and have even established a name of being a gypsy, which seems to be the same term used as a wanderer or a homeless person who lives in the woods type situation. They do not have a political state to live in. The Palestinians as well, and the Basque people who live in Spain in the Pyrenees Mountains, they are also without a nation. And the Kurds as well, Here's a picture of some Kurdish people. There's about 20 million Kurds in the world today, and they are commonly seen as the world's largest nation without a state. There's approximately 10 million Kurds who live in Turkey, 4 million in Iraq, 5 million in Iran, and 1 million in Syria. And probably another million, it's guessed, in the former Soviet Union. About 400,000 of the almost 2 million guest workers from Turkey who live in Germany are of Kurdish origin. Okay, so let's talk about the modern state, the modern political unit of state. The earliest forms of the state emerged once it was possible to centralize power in a durable way. Agriculture and writing are almost everywhere associated with the process of state formation and centralizing power. Agriculture, you've learned in history, allowed for the production and storing of a surplus. And if you had a surplus, this encouraged trade. This was the start of trade. And a surplus allowed and encouraged a particular class of people to rise up. And these people were able to control and protect the agricultural surplus. And they did not have to spend most of their time actually working in the fields or herding the flocks. So they were able to actually, there became a centralization of power over this group of people in this community. And writing then made possible the centralization of vital information. We have to start, when we talk about the modern political state, the modern state, it really started with the dissolving of the Roman Empire. And this led to the fragmentation of the imperial state into the hands of private and decentralized lords, whose political, judicial, and military roles corresponded to the organization of economic production. So we are going from the feudal rule, which was fragmented. You had little feudal lords sprinkled across Europe, and who had what territory. It was indistinct. There were always a lot of wars. And so we went from that to large unitary states that had extensive control over definite territories. And this process gave rise to a highly centralized and more a bureaucratic form of absolute monarchy. We see this absolute monarchy arising from the little feudal states. We see that arising in the 17th and 18th centuries. And that's where the contemporary state system actually took hold and grew. Because these monarchies were able to, for the first time, have a standing army. What is a standing army? They're not sitting. No. A standing army is a group of soldiers who are, their whole purpose in life, their job, is to be a soldier. And previously, when a feudal lord wanted to go to war, he had to call in the peasants and serfs from the fields, and they laid down their implements of agriculture and picked up swords and went to war. Well, now we have standing armies in an absolute monarchy. We also have a central taxation system. So the monarchy can be supported by taxes coming in from the people who live there. We have diplomatic relations all of a sudden with permanent embassies. So you all of a sudden had a permanent group of people who were able to be diplomats and go into other embassies in other countries and monarchies and deal with the issues presenting themselves. And we found the development of mercantilism, which is an economic policy between these states. So the Peace of Westphalia ended both the 30-Year War in Germany and the 80-Year War between Spain and the Netherlands. The treaties involved the Holy Roman Emperor, the kingdoms of Spain, France, and Sweden, the Dutch Republic, and their respective allies among the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Westphalia resulted from the first modern diplomatic congress and initiated a new order in Central Europe that was based on the concept of state sovereignty. And sovereignty is so important for you to know and understand. Sovereignty is the exclusive right to control a government, a country, and a people. So the new universal idea of the modern state was developed by European political philosophers in the 18th century. And now I want to show you a map of what I just want to show you this map of 1914. And these are the colonial powers. You have to kind of look at the key and get the color, but I'll tell you the pink area is the British Empire, upon which the sun never set at this time in 1914. And we're looking here at the colonies that the British Empire had. And we can see that the Indian subcontinent, which is today India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, we can see Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, the first colony in Africa, Ghana, the Gold Coast. We could see Nigeria, Egypt, the Suez Canal used to be solely under British control, Bahama, the Bermuda area, and just various places that you see that are pink. At the time of 1914, they were under British colonial governance. And you could see the green is France, and France consisted of much of West Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, you could see Chad, Gabon, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. But in the 18th century, we see that people owed their allegiance to a state and the people that it represented, rather than a leader or a king. So during the 18th century, we start to see a new concept, which, of course, we had in the United States with the Revolutionary War from Great Britain, but in France, the French Revolution, and this idea of a state spread throughout Europe to Spain and Germany and so on. And much of Africa, because we see that during the European expansion that we went through in this map, during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, we see a redrawing of much of the world in terms of the use of organized space. And we see borders drawn especially in Africa, on the continent of Africa. These borders were drawn for the convenience of the Europeans, the Dutch, the British, the Spanish, the French, who ignored the cultures that were there already. They ignored the political structure of the people of Africa. Now, as many of the colonies have gained political independence, they have kept the idea of state. And they have kept the European borders, interestingly. So this idea of separate statehood grew slowly at first, In 1800, there were 35 colonies in the world, but 35 countries in the world in 1800. By 1939, there were 70 countries, and after World War II, the colonial era brought a rapid increase in the number of sovereign states that govern themselves. And at present, we have over 200 sovereign states. Now, that's an interesting thing in and of itself, but let's look at the spatial examples of spatial, how the size of a state can influence it and its governance. The size of a state, in general, the bigger it is, the better the chance there will be enough resources to support the state. Here we have a compact state, which is a, well, actually, I don't want to talk about that yet. I'll just mention one quick thing. The larger the state, the more resources they will typically have. But Canada and Russia and Australia are large states territorially, with relatively small areas that are capable of being cultivated. So they have to import a large amount of food because they cannot provide that. Even though they're large in area, Russia, for example, spans 13 time zones. It's an enormous country territorially. This is still a fairly accurate map of the territory of Russia right here. And it's this big orange area here, give or take of some areas on the edges. So you see, and it's a very northern climate, so very extreme climate, so they're not able to take care of themselves territorially, agriculturally. But size can also make it tough to communicate and defend a people and keep and take care of these people. In Russia, in particular, after the USSR dissolved, some of the people who lived in the northernmost parts, who would be dependent on the communist way of providing a little bit for everyone, their shipments of supplies and food just completely stopped. And that was because Russia went fairly abruptly into a more market-oriented economy, and the communist way did not apply any longer. So everyone was not given a little bit. So a lot of the people, the citizens up there in those northern reaches of Russia, were left without much help. But that's size, okay? Size is one thing, the size of a state. What about the shape of a state? And here's what I was going to start talking about a little bit ago. Shape can affect the well-being of a state by either helping or hurting that state to be organized. This is an example of a compact state. It's kind of roughly circular. And if you find the center of the state, and you note that the distance from the center to any part of the boundary is about the same. Cambodia, Poland, Zimbabwe in Africa is another good example of a compact state. Uruguay in South America. And usually these compact states can communicate and transport goods and people and services easier, because the boundaries are the same distance to the center everywhere. Now, another shape of state that dictates a lot is a prorub state. And a prorub state is almost compact. You see, this is almost doable here. This is Namibia. It's almost compact, but there's one or two narrow extensions of territory that come out And sometimes, as in the case of Thailand, it's simply a peninsula of land, but sometimes there is a extension that has a very strategic significance or maybe an economic significance, like giving access to resources or water routes. And this is an example in Namibia, which was colonized by the Germans. They wanted access to the Zambezi River. And here is the Zambezi River. And this little stretch, it's called the Caprivi Finger. If you take regional geography, world regional geography, you'll get into all these lovely details. The Caprivi Finger gave Namibia and the Germans colonizing there access to the Zambezi River. So this was important for them. We also have a state, well, here's another little picture. This gives you the size of Namibia. So we sometimes don't realize the size of these African countries. This is an orange Namibia in scale superimposed on the United States eastern seaboard. And you can see that we are going from the Great Lakes completely down to Savannah and then west to Chicago. That entire area would be considered the country of Namibia. So I just wanted you to see that. Okay, so we also have elongated states, and we have these states. I'm going to show you one here. This is Chile. You can look at this while I'm telling you about elongated states. You can see that it's a long, narrow state, the length at least 6 times greater than the average width. So it's not only long, but it's narrow, not very wide. And it is the least efficient state administratively. Countries like Vietnam, Norway, and Chile are, or Chile if you want to say it that way, are long and narrow. And so parts of the country are far from the capital. If you look at the southernmost tip of Chile is, well, let's not even talk about the difference in climate and the climate zones, but you know how far it is if you were to go to the capital city of Santiago, up here where the green dot and the star are. It would be many, many days' journey, and not always, you are not always linked well with communication systems. So it's very isolated to be living in this country sometimes, and you are likely to have a lot of diversity of climate, not only climate, but resources and people. You think of the different types of people who live along the coastline here and the many ethnicities that are represented here, as well as the climate zones and the resources. So uniting a country that is elongated in shape is not easy. We also have fragmented states, and this is easy to figure out. These are states, countries composed entirely of islands. This is Indonesia, and you can see all of the different islands. The Philippines are another good example of a fragmented state. But the islands, a fragmented state, could also be partly on the mainland and with islands included. Italy is a good example in the Mediterranean Sea of a fragmented state. It's a peninsula country, but it also has islands. Malaysia is also partly on a peninsula and an island area. So sometimes we have countries that are chiefly on the mainland, but the territory is separated by another state. And we see this with Pakistan. Pakistan, if you think of the Indian subcontinent, and you remember India is in the middle of that big area. You have Pakistan on the western side and Bangladesh on the eastern side. Those are separate countries now, but they were one state, Pakistan, until 1971. And the eastern part broke away and became Bangladesh. So it is now a sovereign state. They are both still Muslim, but they are sovereign states. And the last shape of state we want to talk about is perforated states. And perforated states, and here I give you an example of South Africa, and there's a tiny little, looks like an isolated island called Lesotho, right in the middle of South Africa. Perforated states are states whose territory completely surrounds the territory of another state, so that it has a hole in it. And this is South Africa, Lesotho. But Italy has two examples of isolated, perforated communities within its borders. One is San Marino and one is Vatican City. They're totally separate political entities from Italy. Now, let's talk just a tad about boundaries. The whole world, even Antarctica, who no country owns, but everyone has a claim to do research in Antarctica, a legitimate legal claim to do research. But the whole world is divided up and claimed by countries. And that brings up the issue of boundaries. And we have several kinds of boundaries to talk about briefly. They're explained very nicely in Fellman. But natural boundaries are those that are divided up and claimed by countries or by physical features. They're very easily recognized physical features, mountains, lakes, or rivers. And even though the natural boundaries seem like a good idea, sometimes they're not really good ideas. One natural boundary that everyone would know is the Danube River that flows through the heart of Europe. The boundary for each country on either side is they go halfway to the middle of the river. So one side belongs to one country and the other side of the Danube belongs to the other country on the other banks of the river. So it's just interesting to think about that. We also have artificial boundaries, which are geometric or straight line boundaries. And we saw that in our scramble for Africa, the continent of Africa, when it was divided by the European powers, Germany and the Netherlands and Great Britain and France, so on. They did straight geometrical boundaries. They all sat around a table and divided Africa up. We have antecedent boundaries, which are drawn before an area is well populated and before there are other cultural landscape features. And a good example of an antecedent boundary would be the 49th parallel, which separates the United States and Canada. Subsequent boundaries are boundaries drawn after the cultural landscape evolves and develops. And there are two types of subsequent boundaries. The one is consequent. That is a border that is drawn to accommodate existing cultural differences. A consequent boundary that I like to use is Northern Ireland and Ireland. So that is a boundary that accommodates religious differences. Ireland is Roman Catholic in religion, and Northern Ireland is Protestant. And they have fought literally in Belfast, and there's been a lot of contention and a lot of fighting going on over religion. In this, we have a boundary now to help to soothe that. The superimposed boundary is a boundary imposed on an area by a conquering or colonizing power that doesn't really care about the existing cultural patterns that were there before they arrived. And we saw in Africa, especially, the superimposed boundaries, straight geometric lines many times. Um, Yugoslavia is another example, in Afghanistan. These boundaries were imposed by a power coming in and not really listening or caring to the people already there. They're a conqueror, they're a colonizer. A relic boundary is a former boundary line that once had meaning but no longer functions as such. I like to think about, and usually there's a landscape feature, be it a fort, a castle, or whatever. One relic boundary is the Great Wall of China that protected the Han Dynasty from the raging hordes of Mongols and Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan. So the boundary of a relic, the definition of a relic boundary, is a former boundary that used to have meaning and no longer functions, but it could still be around. There are a lot of abandoned castles in the zone between Wales and England, which are kind of constitute an old boundary or relic boundary that kept Wales and England separate. Boundary disputes come up. They're often a source of problems in the world. World War II. Since World War II, almost half the countries in the world have been involved in some sort of boundary dispute. One boundary dispute that you may remember was the Berlin Wall that's divided the German city of Berlin into East Berlin and West Berlin. After World War II, the Russians and the Allied powers, United States and European countries, were able to push back the Germans and conquer them and the Japanese. And as a result, the city of Berlin was divided because the Russian soldiers, the Russian army, the Russian nation was able to claim the eastern part of the city for their victor. They were the victor, and that was their spoils. So, because the Russians, the former Soviets, were communist, they did not want any European influence, and the West Berlin became democratic as the West Europe is democratic, and the United States. So we had a terrible wall. It was erected and it was in place for many years until President Reagan told Gorbachev to take down that wall, and the wall did fall. So it's no longer in existence, but parts of it are in museums, I believe. But it's a horrible thing when you had families completely divided by this type of a boundary. Sometimes positional disputes arise because states don't agree about how to interpret a document that defines a boundary. The boundary between the two South American countries of Argentina and Chile was, and this is the actual boundary, to follow the peaks, the highest peaks and the watersheds between the east and west flowing rivers. Okay? Well, sometimes these two things do not always coincide. And Argentina and Chile almost went to war in the late 70s over this, when there was a discovery of massive oil and gas deposits in the disputed area. So sometimes these positional disputes arise over the boundaries because of resources. Territorial disputes arise when a superimposed boundary divides an ethnically homogeneous population. So conflicts can arise when one of the states wants to annex a part of another state to reunite a group of people. Hitler used this as an excuse to invade Czechoslovakia and Poland. He wanted to supposedly reunite pockets of German minorities who lived in Czechoslovakia and Poland. Somalia has had border clashes with Ethiopia over Somalis living in that country as well. Kashmir has long been a disputed area between India and Pakistan, and there have been 2 wars fought over Kashmir so far. It's a lush, rich, mountainous area, and it's been a cause of a lot of conflicts between Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. Sometimes also we have disputes over resources when neighboring states want access to resources from another state. We have had a dispute with Mexico over water rights in the past, water rights from the Colorado River. And the United States, has also had disputes with Canada over fishing grounds. The Gulf War was related to a resource dispute also. Iraq helped justify its invasion of Kuwait, which kicked off the Gulf War, because of a large oil reserve that mostly lies mostly in Iraq, but the oil also lies in Kuwait. And Iraq claimed that Kuwait was slant drilling under the border and in tapping into their oil fields. And so this is their excuse for kicking off the war. So resource disputes arise too over boundaries, and then of course functional boundaries, which we see policies that apply to a boundary are sometimes a cause for problems. And the biggest one that we have right now active in our lives is the US Mexican border and disputes over drugs and immigration. So I hope this quick little video gives you a bit of an insight into what we're starting to understand about the political geography of countries of the world. And please thoroughly read your book and your review book. And part 2 of this video will be coming very soon. Probably I'll be taping it in the next couple of days. So thank you, and God bless you, and have a good day.